Hello and welcome. I'm Tafarag Damu. 66 years ago, the first International Conference of Ethiopian Studies was held in Rome. And recently, Hawassa University hosted its 22nd edition. Well, how has the conference evolved over those years? My guest, Alula Pankhurst, is a member of the International Organizing Committee. A very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
1959, that was the first International Conference of Ethiopian Studies, right?
That's correct, in Rome.
In Rome. And one of the pioneers, probably the leading one, was Professor Enrico Cerulli.
Yes, Enrico Cerulli was a very distinguished scholar and person who studied Ethiopian literature. He was also, of course, one of the people who was involved in the fascist Italian government in Ethiopia. So he had a lot of access to many possibilities of accessing documents. I mean, many churches were burnt and many, in fact, there is a collection of 300 manuscripts at the Vatican that's called the Cerulli collection. So he was involved in donating those, some of which have the stamps of Emperor Haile Selassie on them.
So what was the rationale behind all this, kickstarting this conference in Rome?
So there was scholars of Ethiopia who were studying particularly the manuscripts and the traditions of the Semitic language studies and so forth, were very interested in sharing knowledge. There was a lot more information available. And so they decided to have this first conference in Rome as the first International Conference of Ethiopian Studies. And that tradition has been maintained to this day over 66 years. So it's been continuing in different countries, initially mainly abroad. So it was outside Ethiopia in different countries, in France, in Italy, in Sweden.
But the first conference in Ethiopia was in 1966, right?
That's right. The third one was held in Ethiopia, but then there was a very big gap before it was held in Ethiopia again.
Because 7 years, basically.
Sorry?
7 years in between.
No, I think it was actually much longer because the next international conference in Ethiopia was not till 1984.
No, I know, but between the first conference in Rome and the one that was held in Ethiopia, it's basically 7 years.
That's correct. But then after that, normally it should have gone back to Ethiopia, but it was not actually till the conference in Sweden, in Lund, because in the early years there were very few Ethiopian participants. And then at the conference in Sweden, Professor Rubinson said, we can't have conferences of Ethiopian studies without a strong Ethiopian component. And so after that, any country that hosted it abroad had to ensure that it could cover the costs of a substantial proportion of Ethiopians coming, and gradually the number of Ethiopians started to increase. And also a rule was applied that the conference should be twice abroad and then once in Ethiopia. And then with time, that rule was changed by the International Organizing Committee such that there should be one conference abroad and two in Ethiopia.
And that was again reversed.
That's right. And then again, after a while, it was decided that the conferences in Ethiopia shouldn't be just in Addis Ababa. And so there was a rule that when it is in Ethiopia, it should be once in Addis Ababa and once in one of the regional cities. So it was in Dire Dawa, and since then it's been in Mekelle, and it's been now in Hawassa. So that trend is continuing, and the next conference will also not be in Addis Ababa.
But basically, the Addis Ababa University is the prime owner, if you will, of this conference, right?
That's correct. There was supposed to be a secretariat under the Institute of Ethiopian Studies. It never was fully formalized, but the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, in a sense, has been helping in the organization of the conferences abroad. The last one abroad was in Poland, but there have been conferences in USSR, in Russia at the time. There have been conferences in Norway, in France, in Sweden, in Israel, so many countries. And in fact, it's been twice in Italy, twice in the US, and twice in France. So quite a lot of countries. And of the 23 conferences, 9 have been in Ethiopia, increasing number, because initially there was this, they were mainly held abroad, and now since the last one in Poland, it hasn't been held abroad because the costs of holding a conference abroad are prohibitive. And so it looks like now the conferences are most likely going to be held only in Ethiopia.
So your father, Richard Pankhurst, was one of the individuals behind this conference, right? Right from the get-go in 1959, is that
yes,
correct?
He attended the first one in Rome, and I think most of the ones until he became too ill to participate. So he died in 2017, so he didn't come to the conferences towards the end of his life. But I remember he went to the one in Hamburg in Germany, and the ones in Addis Ababa also, he was part of that.
The International Conference of Ethiopian Studies had its own challenges, right?
Yes.
What comes to mind? There was so many binary fissions, at least a few that I know of. Right?
That's right. So the first big, so it started off very much a series of conferences by scholars who were interested in language, in manuscripts.
In the beginning, primarily foreigners.
Exactly, and it was Semitic scholars. So there was the one organized in Manchester, and then two in Rome and in Paris. And then gradually there came more of an interest in history. So more historians began to become part of it, and more Ethiopians getting involved in participating. There were 2 Ethiopian priests at the first one in Rome, who were in Rome, and they took part. And there were messages from Ethiopia. So gradually the number of Ethiopians increased very dramatically. And then the nature of the conference changed when social science and political science began to come in. And this actually led to a split with the 5th conference. Normally the conferences were held every 3 years. But then there was a split, and there were consecutive 5A and 5B. 5A was held in Nice in France, and 5B was held in Chicago with Donald Levine. And then a lot of American social scientists began to come in, and anthropologists played much of a bigger part. And since then it's
perhaps
grown.
A bit of ego as well?
Yes, indeed, between the personalities of Tubiana in France and Donald Levine in Chicago. So you had these 2 conferences, and I think my parents were probably the only people who went to both conferences, in Nice and also in Chicago.
They're known for being pacifiers.
Well, yes. So they really enjoyed taking part. In fact, my mother wrote in several conferences the history of the conferences. So, a lot of that memory has been lost, but thanks to her contributions in the Lund conference and one of the Addis Ababa conferences, we know a little bit about the stories behind the conferences.
And there was also another such incident, if you will, that involved the University of...
That's right, yes, Harold Marcus.
That involved Harold Marcus.
That's right. So in fact, the conference in Michigan, in Ann Arbor, was quite an eventful one. It was also the first conference at which Harold Marcus suggested that there should be pre-proceedings published. In other words, the tendency was to produce, after the event, proceedings. And there was a logic there, because people present, they get comments, they improve it, and they then produce it. But Harold had this idea, let's get the actual book done before the conference. And so the 13th conference there, or was it, I think, the 12th, which was in Michigan, had the pre-proceedings. And yes, and in fact, the next conference was in Japan, in Kyoto. And the Japanese organizers, they invited me because they felt once Harold Marcus had set this precedent, they felt they had to follow it. So they had all these abstracts and papers coming in, and so they invited me to help them edit it. So I went to Japan twice, in the summer to help with the editing, and then in the winter for the actual conference. But this practice of having pre-proceedings disappeared after a while because it doesn't really make much sense. You want to have the opportunity.
It wasn't, as far as I remember, it was even difficult to have the proceedings published in due course.
Exactly. And in fact, the Addis Ababa conference before, not the latest one, but the previous one, it took 7 years until it was actually published. And by then, most people had given up. The latest Addis Ababa proceedings were ready by the time of the Hawassa conference, which was a really great feat. But, for instance, the Warsaw proceedings in Poland were never published. The Mekelle ones, one volume has been published of museum studies, beautifully done by Konrad and Nina Melchers. And so volume 1 is produced and the second volume will be produced. And I know that the organizers of the Hawassa conference are already planning to do proceedings, because these are very important documents. Many of the presentations there are original research, and it's important that they should be there. For instance, in Trondheim in Norway, they had 2 sets. They had proceedings that were very rapidly done, but just on the internet, and then a selected volume of the best ones that were produced. And on some occasions, groups have published their panels in journals. So, for instance, the Young Lives, my panel at the Mekelle conference was published in the International Journal of Ethiopian Studies by Elias Wendumu.
So we had plenty, at least a few transitions, political transitions in this country, which in a way somehow affected this International Conference of Ethiopian Studies. What figures in here is the 1974 revolution, which also affected you as a family.
Yes, but just on the personal note, my parents, I think, were very reluctant to leave Ethiopia, but they had teenage children, and I think it was a decision mainly to do with that. And of course, my father felt very much in exile in UK and always wanted to come back, and in the 80s began to come back for conferences, and then late 80s I came to do my research. My sister came to do research also, and my father, we then came back at the end of 1990. But yes, the impact on the conference was really quite dramatic. It meant that after the revolution, most of the Ethiopians who participated in the conferences that were held largely abroad were diaspora Ethiopians, or Ethiopians who had gone to study and stayed in Europe and America. And so it took a long time. The Moscow conference, of course, with the influence of the Soviet Union, there was quite a big delegation from Ethiopia. And then with the collapse of the Derg and the coming to power of the EPRDF, the conferences began to be held much more in Ethiopia, and the proportion and percentage of Ethiopians increased and became dominant ever since then. Most of the participants are Ethiopian. So for instance, at the latest conference, which has had the largest number of participants, there have been 520 people who are participants, and out of those, only 125 came from abroad.
This Hawassa conference.
The Hawassa conference that was just held now. And of those, some of those were Ethiopians who were living abroad. So there were, I think, only 114 foreigners out of 520 participants and 300 presentations, which is extraordinary. It's enormous, with a range of different topics.
It helps that it is held in Ethiopia, right?
Yes, very much so, because it means...
Logistically speaking?
Well, it's logistically, it's now impossible. I mean, it's been 10 years since it was abroad in Poland, but to be able to afford to send a large proportion of Ethiopians abroad for most countries is not possible. And then, of course, visa problems now with the Schengen visa for Europe is really problematic. And actually, that was the logic that led to the conference in Dire Dawa, because El Wafike, who's the chairman of the organizing committee, he was based at the French Center of Ethiopian Studies, and there was talk of it being held in France, but it had been in France twice already, and they couldn't raise the money. But he raised enough money to hold it in Dire Dawa and for the French Center to support it. And that set a trend of having the conferences at least once in over two times outside Ethiopia, and it now outside Addis Ababa. So the rule was once in Addis Ababa, once in a regional city, but it now looks like we're moving to once in Addis Ababa, twice in a regional city, because we had it in Hawassa. And so the next one will be in Bahir Dar, although it's not still quite clear whether it will be Addis Ababa first and then in Bahir Dar, possibly the latter.
You have already mentioned a few points, but what else makes the conference in Hawassa any different from the previous ones?
So the
theme-wise, discipline-wise?
Yes. So the Hawassa conference, first of all, it was, I think, one of the most impressive and successful conferences, just in terms of the numbers, over 500 people. That's never happened. 200, 300, 5 days, from the Monday through to the Friday. And then in terms of the number of panels, there were 19 panels with different sub-panels. Even the booklet of just the titles runs to 55 pages. This booklet of the conference schedule and dates. Then there was very important plenaries. We had the plenary by Professor Belay Kasa and the one by Professor Zainabu Gabramariam. So we had plenaries and then parallel sessions on so many themes. So it starts with agronomy and you go on to archaeology, artificial intelligence, art, architecture, humanities, manuscripts, food security, just it goes on and on. History, human geography, environment, indigenous knowledge, political science, anthropology, and so forth. So it was very, very vast, and our Hawassa hosts did an incredibly good job of making everybody feel at home. I mean, the atmosphere there, the lake, we had excursions to visit the lake, and the mayor held dinners, and it was just a very nice occasion for scholars who've been working on Ethiopia to come together to welcome and listen to young researchers. There were many young Ethiopian researchers who presented very groundbreaking, interesting research on different panels.
Was there policymakers or influencers as participants there?
Yes, I mean, generally this tends to be more of an academic setting.
But certainly those interested who could pick some for their policymaking, whatever.
Absolutely, absolutely. And many of the sessions in political science, in food security, in development issues, had strong policy recommendations. The panel I was involved in with Young Lives, we had 10 papers that looked at youth transitions in a time of multiple crises. So we had papers on migration and how young people's aspirations have changed to leave. We had papers on early marriage and how that's been exacerbated with conflict. We had papers on mental health and the mental health impact of conflict in Tigray and Amhara region. We had all kinds of papers that looked at unemployment and the way that the very high inflation and lack of jobs is affecting young people and leading many of them to give up hope and have mental health breakdowns or want to leave the country. So those kinds of panels had very important policy implications. But then there was also a lot of panels that presented very interesting studies on cultural issues. For instance, there was a very interesting paper that looked at how the icons and manuscripts that are produced has links to India and to other countries. And then there was a really very, very nice panel of ethnographic films, which was organized by Professor Itsushi Kawaze, who presented his film on the Asmaris, and Hugues Fontaine presented a film on the earliest footage available in 1909, in which you see Atse Minilik coming back from a Maskal festival in a carriage. And this was at the time of his stroke. So this is the last footage of Emperor Menelik, and other sequences from Harar and sequences of a ruler from Tigray who had been defeated, coming and bowing in front of Menelik, carrying the stone on his shoulder. So very impressive ethnographic footage was presented by Hugues Fontaine, and many other interesting ethnographic films. So it was a very enjoyable conference with a lot of diversity and so many different presentations.
Looking forward, what do you see happening in the next 10 years as far as this conference is concerned? What comes to mind?
Well, there are not international conferences in other countries. This is quite exceptional. It's a unique Ethiopian phenomenon, and it has lasted 66 years, and it's a very strong institution with this organizing committee that has members from all the different countries, and under the leadership of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, and the director, Dr. Johannes Adega, really did an incredible job. And I also want to commend Professor Tesfaye Semela and his team, because they did such an incredible job, and there were so many organizational issues. And just to give you one little example, at the end, they called to congratulate all the support staff who were cleaning the toilets, because the toilets were kept impeccable, which is often a problem when you have more than 500 people.
This many, yeah.
And they had so many, for instance, they had book launches. So there was a launch of a book that was edited by Margot Herrmann of the history of women in Ethiopia. So that book was launched, and several other books were launched, and there was stalls where the latest proceedings from the Addis Ababa International Conference were on sale as well. So the organization of the conference by the Hawassa team was impeccable, and everybody really enjoyed it. There was side events, there was dinners that were held at a hotel, and just the atmosphere was really wonderful. So what from now onwards? Well,
do you see it bigger in terms of size, in terms of participation, in terms of diversity and all that?
Yes, I think it's bound to continue, and it's a very strong institution under the Institute of Ethiopian Studies. The question is, will it ever go abroad again? And I suspect the answer is not, because although it's open to any country to propose to hold it, the cost of trying to afford to bring a sufficient number of Ethiopian scholars abroad, and each time when it was abroad, it became a big competition who could go, and a lot of people were excluded because there wasn't enough funding. And then I think also it being held more in regional universities. So there are many regional universities that want to host it. Amongst those that suggested, there was Jimma, there was Dilla, there was Arba Minch, and there are many others. There was Wello University also requested to host it, and the International Organizing Committee felt that amongst those that had offered, which was included Wello University and Dilla University, the other two were first generation universities, Jimma and Bahar Dar. And Bahar Dar had requested several times before.
So that's why it went there. So
next time it will either be in Addis Ababa and then Bahar Dar or Bahar Dar. So I think it will continue to grow, and it will continue to have much more Ethiopian participants. So already now we're talking about 2/3 at least being Ethiopian participants. And I believe that it's a gathering of people who are studying in different subjects. Whether it will break up into separate conferences by disciplines, that's something that we will have to see.
Interesting. Alula, thank you very much.
It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.